Prime Minister, thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your support of Fortune Most Powerful Women and the Fortune Global Forum. We had you on stage, the Fortune Most Powerful Women, back in Washington. Mm-hmm. Patty interviewed you. You were interviewed by Alan at the Fortune Global Forum just a couple weeks ago. We tremendously thank you for your support. But here's the thing.
There's always a thing.
There's always a thing. So we're known for being kind of cultural centric as Americans. So I have to ask you, what is it that Americans don't get about Canadians? Well, how are we?
See, you think of us as so polite. And so nice, and we are, most of the time. But when it comes to standing up for what's right, standing up for ourselves, you can never count us out.
Okay, that's a good answer. Okay. Which leads us into our next question.
So, I suspected it might.
The past year of your life. So you were involved in a high-wire negotiation with a president of the United States who is unpredictable and sure loves a good fight. The NAFTA, which I always love, NAFTA is North America Free Trade Agreement. Now we're all separate. We're USMCA, sadly, but there we are. So you had these negotiations with this unpredictable, fight-loving president, which must have been an incredibly tense and difficult time for you, and political high stakes. I mean, you needed this thing to end well. I wanted to ask you, actually, on a personal level, was there anything that you called on in your inner self about advice from your father, from his tenure? Were there moments where you thought back on what he'd been through or advice he might have given you that ended up being a North Star in any of this?
My father was very good at tuning out the things that didn't matter as much as the main thing. He was able to focus on doing some really big things for this country, and in this job, like in any job, there's always lots of things you have to deal with that seem very urgent but aren't always the most important things. Right. And there are very few things as important to Canada and to Canadians as our trade relationship with the United States. Canada has always been a trading nation. We've always been a country with more natural resources than we could consume and utilize on our own. So we've always depended on trade, and we have been fortunate to have access to this extraordinary neighbor, this extraordinary market to our south that has been a huge part of our success. So you talk about the high stakes or the importance for me of these negotiations. No, these negotiations were important for Canadians. And the thing that I did and my whole team did, including the extraordinary Chrystia Freeland, who I think is here tonight. Is Chrystia? Yeah. Was that we stayed focused on getting to the right deal for Canada. One of the easy things for us was that we knew that it wasn't a zero-sum game, that the right deal for Canada would go hand in hand with the right deal for the United States. They didn't have to be a winner and a loser, that the nature of our economies being so closely connected and intertwined means that if we got to a good deal, it would be good for both of us, and that's actually for all three of us.
But on a personal level, again, going back to that, I mean, and I mean, this is, as a leader, you faced some very difficult times. You had the United States president calling you dishonest and weak. Publicly, you had, it couldn't have been, give us some sense of your inner guidance going forward on that.
I think one of the things that served quite well in this is that we didn't react to the level of rhetoric that was sometimes directed our way or my way. We stayed focused on working hard, rolling up our sleeves, being creative and flexible and thoughtful at the negotiating table, And I stayed very even-keeled throughout in my public statements and in my private statements.
Was there, let me stop you there.
So when I said something like, we will not take a deal without an intact Chapter 19. We will not take a deal without protecting the cultural exemption that is so important to Canadians. Those things that I chose to step out and say in an uncompromising and clear way resonated more than if I'd been sort of saying all sorts of different things constantly every few days.
So you picked your shots.
Picked my shots and stayed even-keeled so you actually noticed them when they came.
That's very good leadership advice. What did you learn from Chrystia Freeland during this?
Well, what I learned about Chrystia Freeland is never, ever to underestimate her and to believe, and I guess as a leadership style, if you have the absolute toughest job that is a live or die situation that you need to get done the right way, give it to the best woman you know. Okay. With the exception of my wife. I would have given it to her, but Chrystia was...
But what about her style that really took things forward?
She is brilliant and even-keeled and thoughtful and extremely well grounded in who she is and in the person
she is so real. I mean, she told us at the Fortune Global Forum a couple weeks ago that when she was done, she went in your office and just laid down on the floor. I thought that captured everything quite well. So the business community, it was a great effect for you politically. The business community is rallied around you, though there remains some skepticism. And I know you brought up two of your initiatives about climate change and pay equity. But the business community, the part that's skeptical, would say what we really need to worry about now that trade is behind and we have certainty is competitiveness. Mm-hmm. And the American tax reform, which, as we all know, reduced the corporate tax rate, has made American companies more competitive. And the Canadian Business Council said, the fact that you haven't done anything yet is 10 times more, it hurts the economy 10 times more than if NAFTA had ended, and cites numbers like the potential loss of over 600,000 jobs. How do you respond to that?
Well, first of all, on tax rates, Canada continues to be competitive with the United States. What happened was the U.S. brought down their tax rates to something resembling what Canadian corporate tax rates have been for a long time. But yes, we are...
But you're higher now. You're 27.
Well, it's pretty close.
Okay.
We are very much conscious and aware of the need to remain competitive with the U.S. market that we're so close to. But tax rates aren't the only thing a company looks at when they're looking to invest. You look at availability of labor, you look at stability, whether it's economic, political, fiscal stability. Our debt to GDP level is the lowest in the G7. Our economic growth is among the highest. We are a country that, when I talk to a lot of global companies that say, what we really need to do is be able to bring in our top talent from around the world to set up a new engineering shop or a new research center or a new facility. We say, great, we can give you a visa in 2 weeks for your top talent. We're a country that is open to immigration right now. You know what? Being able to get the top talent and draw on big pools of well-educated, ambitious, forward-thinking, diverse population is a hell of a competitive advantage that I don't see the U.S. matching anytime soon.
Let's talk about immigration. Do you worry about a backlash? There's concern that there's too many asylum seekers coming into your borders. There's concern about the burden on communities. What's your take on that?
One of the most precious responsibilities I have custodianship over in Canada is the fact that Canadians are positively inclined towards immigration. Canadians know that immigration over the past decades, over the past generations, over the past centuries is actually what created our success in Canada and indeed in North America. waves of people coming here to build a better life for themselves and mostly their kids is what has created these extraordinary success stories that make up North America. Canadians remain positively inclined towards immigration. And one of the reasons are Canadians have confidence in our immigration system. We are actually able to take in 1% of our almost 1% of our population every year in immigration, a little over 300,000, almost 350,000 people every year. And we're able to do that because we have a system that Canadians have confidence in. It's rules-based, it's controlled. So even when we have, and there are a few thousand irregular migrants who are crossing over from the United States in between border crossings, but every single one of them is screened, given an immediate background check for security purposes, and is put through our immigration and our refugee and asylum seeker process. And at the end of a year or two or three or however long it takes, because the backlog's getting a little bigger, they will have a determination, yes, you're a refugee, you get to stay in Canada, or you're not, and you're going to have to be sent back to your country of origin. But the fact that Canadians continue to have confidence in our immigration system, and that all political parties, on the left and right wing of the spectrum, are aware that immigration has been a positive force for this country, means we don't have the kinds of negative, divisive debates that happen elsewhere around the world.
So let's talk about human rights and specifically Saudi Arabia. You guys were so really on the cutting edge of Saudi human rights concerns this summer when Christie tweeted about dissidents being jailed. The Saudis took fairly dramatic action. And then now we have, of course, the death, the killing of Khashoggi. And you have said they will pay there'll be consequences. It's an interesting, to me, it's a fascinating moment in the history for governments, history with Saudi Arabia. Do you think it's a watershed moment, by the way, in terms of governments doing business in Saudi Arabia?
I think the Saudis have been a little taken aback by the vehemence of the response of the world that has known for a long time that Saudi Arabia doesn't let its women drive, for example. There has been a level of thinking in Saudi Arabia that the rules that we put elsewhere didn't sort of apply to them, and they were, I think, genuinely shocked and stunned when a journalist was murdered and there was a huge reaction. But I think it was a culmination of a number of things. I don't want to get into analysis, but for a lot of us, certainly for me, defending a free press, defending journalists to be able to do their job in holding governments to account is not just a nice to have in a democracy or in a society, it's essential for a society to be free. And I think a lot of people realize that you cannot let this happen, and it crossed the line.
But Western companies have been doing a lot of business with a country that is demonstrably not free. They don't hold themselves out as a democracy.
Including Canada.
Including Canada. And now you're faced with this prospect of, you've got an arms deal that, how many jobs, 3,000 jobs in London are dependent on this General Dynamics contract. What's the decision you're going to make on that?
We are looking very carefully at what the path forward is going to be. I think the first thing we have to do is determine to a greater degree of certainty how what happened to Jamal Khashoggi actually happened. There needs to be an accountability and a better response than has come till now from Saudi Arabia on that. And then I think the global community is going to have to make some decisions. And I think citizens are going to be pushing people into it. But there's focus on Saudi's response.
Sorry for interrupting. There's a lot countries have focused on the Saudi response, but in fact, you know the facts. I mean, you have enough intel to know presumably what happened. So when is there, what do you think that, how do you think Western companies and countries will be reacting to this?
Well, I think that really depends on, and I do think it does depend on how Saudi Arabia actually accounts for or reflects on or takes ownership of or distances itself from the actions that we know were taken. And I think that's what, and it's not even governments, because as you said, I mean, Saudi Arabia is a really important regional player for peace and stability in a very unstable part of the world. They do play a role, but I think citizens are rightly quite outraged at this behavior, and there is going to be a need to reflect carefully on how governments respond to their citizens' real concerns and outrage, how Saudi Arabia thinks about how it wants to allay fears, not amongst leaders of governments who understand how important Saudi Arabia is for geopolitical stability, but ordinary men and women around the world who vote, who donate to political parties, who say, you know what, this doesn't sit well with me, this doesn't sit with my values as a person, I don't like seeing this, and I want people to actually address it in a way that satisfies me. Now, how we're going to square that circle as a global community, as leaders of different countries, is still to be written. And for me, I'm going to reflect very carefully and listen to a lot of people around what they think we should be doing, and I'm going to, try and make the right decision, and I don't know yet how it is. We've said a number of times that, as we have in the past, we're willing to suspend export permits to Saudi Arabia, but there's a whole context that still needs to be reflected through, and as I do in so many situations, I have confidence that ordinary citizens around the world, particularly of Western democracies that have dealings and important relationships with Saudi Arabia, those citizens need to be asking really tough questions of their leaders, the way I'm being asked really tough questions now of how many jobs, and not just now from you, Nina, but now from citizens, of how many jobs are worth it in the balance of continuing to turn a blind eye to really questionable behaviors.
So let's end this interview since we're out of time. I'm sure you're happy to hear that. So
I think I said enough already.
Reflecting on your leadership, you have enough of a tenure behind you. You're in the next year facing election. Let's compare your tenure and your leadership style as a prime minister to your father's. How would you compare it? Who had a big, though polarizing personality.
My father was a prime minister for 16 years, and in his first 3 years of prime minister, he did a number of big things. I think I have an expectation, I don't think anyone lasts as long as they did a number of years ago. Sophie has not allowed me to be prime minister for 16 years, even if Canadians were to allow it, which probably wouldn't happen. We don't have term limits in Canada, but they happen naturally. But I think for me, we've been focused on doing a lot of really big things right off the top. One of the biggest things we did right away was bring in the Canada Child Benefit, which has given money to low-income and middle-income families every month to help with the costs of raising their kids, hundreds of dollars a month tax-free. That has made a huge difference. So those are the kinds of,
but again, going back to comparisons with your father, how would you compare your style?
My father came into politics with a lot of academic notions of what a just society needs to be, and very clear goals, whether it was bilingualism or multiculturalism or repatriating the Constitution and adding a Charter of Rights and Freedoms that he drove towards, and he really focused on those big things. He was an academic. I'm more of a teacher. Teachers are more interested in process. My background is as a school teacher. So for me, I am much more willing than my father ever was to let Canadians have a say and to listen to people and learn from all of them rather than to come in with preconceived notions of, you know, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. My goal is to empower citizens to create the best possible society. A good teacher isn't someone who gives the answers to the students. A good teacher is someone who allows the students to find the answers to themselves. So a good politician must enable citizens to actually develop the better society without, you know, in a paternalistic way, drop that society onto them. However clever it was for the time, I'm much more trusting of Canadians and our ability to pick the right path forward, even when, you know, the world seems to be going in different directions. I trust Canadians to bring us in the right one.
That is so well said, Prime Minister. Thank you so much. That was terrific. Thank you. Thank you.